Trust has become one of the most valuable and fragile assets a company possesses. As stakeholder expectations continue to evolve, boards are being called upon not only to oversee performance, but also to establish the credibility, transparency, and accountability that underpin long term success. In this segment, we'll explore what it means for governance to serve as an anchor of trust and what directors can do when that trust begins to erode. We will be speaking with Maria del Carmen Garcia Nielsen, Director of Mibanco, founder and president of Wharton Alumni for Boards, and author of the Directors and Boards article, The New Stewardship Governance as the Anchor of Trust. Maria, in your article, The New Stewardship Governance as the Anchor of Trust, as the title says, you state that governance is increasingly becoming the anchor of trust for companies. In practical boardroom terms, what are the clearest signals that a board is actively building trust with stakeholders rather than simply assuming it already exists?
Yes, I think that one of the clearest signals to your question is whether a board is treating trust as something that must be continuously earned as opposed to assuming that our reputation and our past performance is enough, right? And I think in practical terms to your question, boards that actively do that work on three things: um, transparency, accountability, and alignment between values and actual decisions, right? And let me walk through those. As far as transparency, I think boards that do a good job at creating the right environment for not only the positive outcomes, but difficult issues to come to the boardroom, do an excellent job in creating and building that muscle and that culture for management to be able to talk through difficult situations and work through difficult issues with the boardroom rather than waiting for a problem to escalate, right? Um, as far as accountability, I think the way boards tolerate reward and reject things matters, right? And I think that also helps to signal to the whole organization and stakeholders what's important and what is that tone at the top. And the third thing is that, the values alignment, um, again, very related to transparency and accountability. Do we question whether certain decisions in capital allocation, incentives, leadership behaviors that we, that are commendable within the boardroom based on results, is that aligned with our purpose, our mission, our values, and those other, elements that we might have worked through in our strategy sessions.
You talked a little bit about the idea of basing on results, right? And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here. Many boards still measure success primarily through financial and operational performance. How should directors think about oversight of transparency, accountability, and corporate values without drifting into vague or performative governance?
And perhaps those two things are a bit interrelated, right? I believe that in the long term, um, performance and outcomes are related to transparency, culture, and accountability, right? In the long term, perhaps more difficult to see often in the short term. But I think one of the unique things that boards and directors bring to the conversation are that we're able to put on sort of our high beams, as in, when we're driving, right, in a dark road in a car. Because often with management, and I've held that management roles, we're very immersed in our expected outcomes, in execution timelines, in carrying out, the plan as expected, right? And so it's important for the board to come in and take a step back and question and revisit whether those outcomes are within the realms of our purpose, our mission, our vision, without just being, a phrase that is parked or in a poster somewhere outside, right? And especially today in an environment where change and velocity, you've talked in directors and boards on about Bani, right? The brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible. That environment often cannot wait for the procedures and manuals to be written because things are happening so fast. So it's almost that, values become that operating system that, our employees definitely have to sort of trust and use judgment when things may be a little bit ambiguous, right? So I think it's important for boards to track that. And the other side of that coin of digitization, it does bring that pressure of, a banned environment, but it also allows boards to have more information and data driven items that they can sort of use to contrast vis-a-vis the more prepared presentations that maybe management works through, right? So we have those two visions of reality. Yes, the informed packages that we get from management that they work so hard to prepare, but also those, the data on employee rotation, health and safety, what's coming through whistleblower and, we call them ethical channels in Europe, that are, what are the procedures and how robust are our systems that support, the reaction to what the data is saying and signaling. So I do think that boards can, do well to always question whether values are aligned with the results that we're pursuing and applauding. So it doesn't become just, something that is a bit performative, right?
When trust begins to erode, whether that be employees, investors, regulators, or customers, what are the earliest warning signs a board tends to miss, and what should directors do differently before the issue becomes a crisis?
We're probably in an environment where it's not really the risk of absence of information. It's more how we filter, all the information that we're privy to. And probably, when we look at cases of failures, we can probably do a postmortem and trace that there were some signals available to management and the boards, on employee behavior, operational data, customer complaints, right? That might have been early signals to, to the situation at hand. Because as I said before, we may become accustomed to that filter reality of the presentations that we receive. And so I do think that we have to do our work. Yes, preparing to interpret that, the presentations that management prepares, but also really work on our curiosity and inquisitiveness, our external sourcing of information so that we can look around the corners. We can, in a respectful way, try to understand, what are some inconsistencies in the narratives that we are receiving. What are some challenging questions that we can pose, perhaps to not to get the right answer, but to work and deliberate with management as to what the options may be, whether we're considering, all of the different or seeing all different angles to a specific situation. Because I do think stakeholders are very conscious of things that are a bit too curated, right? A bit too, communications that may be too perfect, as opposed to authentic in the way that things are presented. And also, I think we have to realize as board members that the environment, customers, employees, society is changing. So it's very really unrealistic to think that the only thing that's not changing is how we behave and how we react to data and how we come prepared to the boardroom, right? I think we have to be just as active and with the same velocity of change approach, the change in society to basically treat the problems and the oversight that we're responsible for. And so that preparedness and the questions that we work on is very important. And the other thing that I mentioned is that trust must also be ensured so that management feels safe in bringing forth um, perhaps a problem that they don't have a complete solution for. Right? We have to ensure that we're able to have the process governance systems, whether it is the risk map in the audit committee, right? Those conversations that may be signaling something, that we alert management that from our point of view, certain controls may trigger a specific conversation, a specific exercise to quantify a problem, as opposed to just leaving it as a risk phrase that is contained for public disclosure, right? If we operationalize those conversations, I think we can work on that muscle that I said, right? Work on that muscle to work together through, challenging conversations, management and board members. And the last thing I would say is also that the the way that in our toolbox, right? Like in Europe, the CSRD, perhaps taking a step back now in how it's being deployed, time wise and its scope. Um, may signal to some people that hey, when something sustainability ESG was important, now we're taking a step back. I think it's the other way around. That's when boards need to really step up, because we have to be realistic and know that there's ebb and flows for different issues and different conversations in society. But what remains constant is really our purpose, our mission, our vision, that insistence on always ensuring that we're doing right by the things that we want to stand for, right? I think that, regardless of what dictates, whether it's political or regulation, I think boards need to do their own work on setting that, that way and the pattern or behavior. It's not something that we can outsource to regulators or to directives. So I think that's, to your question on when trust erodes, right? I think if we're constant in the work that we have to do, in the challenges, and being perhaps audacious in the conversations that we must affront, we can be early enough to curtail some problems that we may face if not.